for teaching us today, brother. Come on up.
Okay. All right. Well, I think I have until about 10:30. Is that correct? 10:30?
10:35ish.
Okay. So last week Virgil taught about adultery and lust, and I think he needed a break. So he's off in Ohio, and so I was glad he got done with that. So I thought we'd switch off into something else. So I've got 7 lessons from the book of Job. I don't know if we'll get to all of them. That'll be fine. Maybe we can discuss some as we go along, and if we don't get to them, that'll be okay. I could at least show them to you, maybe. But I think there's a caricature of Job that probably we are aware of in the Christian church. It's Job is a great guy. He's a great servant of God, and so God says, I think I'll put Job to the test, and we'll have this contest with Satan, and there's this thing over the top of it that Job doesn't know about. And then Job goes to all his friends, and his friends are terrible counselors, right? And they're just bad guys. But they're not really bad, they're just not good counselors. So then Job looks pretty good, but then really God shows up, and Job's not right either. So everybody's wrong. But then Job's not as wrong as his friends, so God rewards Job, and that's kind of the story, right? So we have this kind of big picture story of Job, but I think we don't, maybe there's some things we miss out when we just think of Job as that big picture. So that's kind of what I was trying to aim for today, is to go a little deeper into the book of Job and maybe see some things that we would normally miss by just looking at the 10,000-foot view of Job. So the book of Job is it's considered to be one of the great books of ancient literature. Like you think about, I think more so even than some of the other books of the Bible. So a lot of people in the colleges or universities will maybe compare it to, like a Greek tragedies, or the book, something that Homer wrote or something like that. So it's very well respected by non-Christians, at least as much as the book of the Bible could be, I suppose. And I think it would be good for us then, obviously, as Christians, to know, as much about it as we can, to understand why it has that role. And I think it fills in some gaps for us in our faith that maybe no other book really can in the Old Testament. So for those reasons, I thought we would just go ahead and take a look. So we're going to try to look at these 7 lessons, and Allison, you can give me the first one there. So I looked in vain for a succinct few verses that would make this point. But I think really the whole book of Job makes this point, and y'all can you can tell me what you think about this. But suffering has the power to get us in tune with real life. I think Job, as you read some of the things he says here, he's obviously really struggling, right? He has all these health issues. He's going through all these things. He doesn't understand why they're happening. And so in the process of that, he's having this contest in his mind with God, and he's going over this, trying to figure it all out. And I think what it does, and maybe this is just a generalization that I get from the book of Job, tell me what you think. I think when you go through suffering like that, it heightens your awareness to life in general. And I say that somewhat as an academic, in the sense that I don't feel like I've suffered a lot in my life, but I think that just from listening to people that have, and to studying people that have been in difficult situations, like I think about, I do a lot of reading in terms of people who've been in prison, like the Russian writers like Solzhenitsyn, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Christians who have been imprisoned, people who have been threatened with martyrdom for their faith. And obviously, in our church, there are people who are suffering. I mean, we just heard, a lot of people that have different diseases and health problems and things like that. So I think it just brings a different perspective. And I kind of wanted to maybe get an idea of what you all think about that in a minute. But I think another just a couple of things that I think would bring this point out. I've read this before, like and maybe you've heard this, people that go into battle, like people in the military that are getting ready to go into a battle or war zone. It seems like some of the stories that you hear from them are that moment right before the battle is extremely memorable, like it's very vivid to them. And there's a heightened awareness to life in general right before that happens. And so,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
But no, with Gordon, some of the things he will talk about when he was over in Afghanistan, especially. But some of the things that made him realize more who God is.
Yeah. Right.
And how much we don't realize, about how his love and protection.
How involved God really is in our lives.
Yeah.
Well, so Jonathan Edwards, the Puritan theologian, he would, I think one of his resolutions was to always be thinking about the day of my death. To always, always come to mind that I'm going to die and what that would be like if I was to die. Not things that we would usually want to contemplate, perhaps, but just because you have that appreciation for life, I think, when you see that maybe you're not going to have it, or that it's compromised in some way. So another way, it doesn't just have to be a sickness, though. Another way, I think, to get this vividness out of life is to, and it's what the monks do so well. And I do a lot of reading Lori says maybe if we weren't married and I was in another life, somehow I might have been a monk, because I'm very reclusive and I like to think a lot and just spend some time alone thinking. And the monks do that well. I don't know if I could really do the monk life, but yeah, it's pretty tough. It's really not easy. But there's a movie we watched recently. I just thought I'd got a few resources here I might share with you. This is called Into Great Silence. And it's a movie about these monks over, I think, in France. And it's not like your normal movie. Like, you need to have a cup of coffee when you watch this, or you might fall asleep. Because it's these monks, and there's not a lot of talk. It's French, so there's no reason you don't want to. You can understand them anyway. But they filmed it. I don't know when they filmed this, but they came to these monks, and they said, "Hey, we'd love to make a movie about your life here in the monastery." And they said, "All right, we'll discuss this and we'll get back to you." And 16 years later, they said, "Okay, we're ready. You can come film us now." That's the pace. It gives you an idea of the pace, this movie. But geared down, right, to first gear. And what happens when we gear down is, I think, life. The way we perceive life completely changes. And that's what you get out of this movie. And so, when you reduce it down to contemplation with God and prayer, and they work, but it's like they work and then they take a break and pray. And it's like, if you didn't get anything much done on your work, no problem. You're going to have more time later. And it's just, the whole focus is contemplation on God. Yeah.
I think that, in a way, is why camp is so effective in reaching children in family camp and everything.
Yeah.
That it's taking you out of your normal routine in life and putting you in just an environment of almost a different dimension.
Yeah. Lori and I were camp counselors a long time ago. We met at camp. And it's a whole different environment. Okay, it's a whole different environment, right? And you're pulled away. So, yeah, I get that. So I think when you go into a time of suffering, everything changes, and life the flow of life becomes different. And I think in those times, and I think we see that in the book of Job, that I think you have this heightened sense of awareness. And I think that's part of what happens in the book of Job.
I know, so not necessarily like you were saying, like the suffering, but when when I've done extended periods of fasting, I am shocked at
Mhm.
how everything slows down. Like, whoa, it's like the Lord put me in a time warp. And
Mhm.
fasting is hard, but when I'm amazed by that, and that's like just that little tiny smidge of physical suffering, but it has you. I'm
Yeah.
amazed at how in tune.
Yeah, and that would obviously be a
That would be
practice the monks
monkish,
would,
yes,
monkish, yeah,
yes.
exactly. So,
My kids are gonna thank you for that movie, by the way, because we're studying monks right now. So
you're
that
gonna, you
was-
wanna watch this movie?
Yeah, oh, that was a real gem.
Okay, be sure you get some coffee.
Yeah, I know, they're gonna be real thankful to you.
So I guess the takeaway is, I've got it here, you learn to suffer properly, to learn to sacrifice, to be able to give up things, and to live without things so you can get the best thing, is kind of the idea. And so Job goes through that, and I think that's part of it. So it's not a popular American strategy, but it's certainly biblical. So there's the first principle. I don't know what we can, are y'all good with that one, or should it go on, or is that accurate, or am I way off base, or, okay, let's go to the second one. Okay, Job lives in a world of metaphysical realism, and so should we. What is that, right? All right, well, I've been reading another book, more monk stuff, I guess, The Benedictine Option. This is a book by Rod Dreher. I mentioned him a while back, but he's a modern writer. But the premise of this book is the church is in big trouble in North America, and one way maybe forward is the Benedictine option, which is, I'm in the middle of this book, but it's basically what we're talking about, getting back to more of a monk kind of approach, I guess, to Christianity. So that's a real short summary of this book. But I wanted to read a few things in the Benedictine option here and explain to you what metaphysical realism is. So let me see if I can do that in a couple of quotes here. Okay, so he says there were 5 landmark events over 7 centuries that rocked Western civilization and stripped it of its ancestral faith. 5 landmark events. I won't read them all, but the first one he mentions is in the 14th century, the loss of belief in the integral connection between God and creation, or in the philosophic terms, transcendent reality and material reality. Let me explain that. The people of the Middle Ages lived in what philosopher Charles Taylor calls the enchanted world, one so unlike ours that we struggle to imagine it. We in the modern West are on a distant shore, and the worldview of our medieval ancestors is over the horizon, far from view. Medievals experienced the divine as far more present in their daily lives, as it has been for most people, Christians and otherwise, throughout history. Religion was everywhere, and this is crucial, as a matter not merely of belief but of experience. In the mind of medieval Christendom, the spirit world and the material world penetrated each other. The division between them was thin and porous. Another way to put this is that the medievals experienced everything in the world sacramentally. So, one of the ways to think about this, we make a sharp division between natural and supernatural, don't we? I mean, we just naturally, we make that division in our minds. Well, this is a natural event, this is supernatural, a miracle, right? The medieval period, all this is jammed together. And the way they thought is very different from how we think in the 21st century. And to me, that was very interesting. Like, our mind, it's sort of like how the technological revolution has changed how our kids think. Like, they think differently than we do, right? Because they're on their phones all the time, and they're on computers all the time. So their mind is being changed from what our minds were like in the 20th century. And if you just move that back several centuries, what the medieval mind must have been like is totally different from ours. Yeah.
It may sound strange, but when we were in South America ministering in Ecuador, among the Roman Catholics, which are the dominant religion, but We were having a discussion too when we went out to pray for David Jacobson
Yeah.
and claiming the blood of Christ and over the mites and that. I had mentioned that when we were ministering in South America, this metaphysical idea is really ingrained in the Latin people. And of course we call it syncretism, or we call the combination of Christianity, the syncretism in paganism. On Sunday they're at Mass, but on Monday they're out seeking the white or the witch doctor. Or the
Well,
black witch
that's a little
doctor.
different than what I'm. Yeah, you know.
Okay, I understand, but the aspect of the spirit world
Right.
Very
being
present.
involved
Right.
in your daily life,
Yeah.
maybe we saw more miracles and more things God did, not because we were more spiritual or whatever it is, but the expectation of people that God would work and that the supernatural intervenes in
Yeah,
your life.
right.
That's what you're getting at.
It is, and
And
I think
that was one of the things that we learned there.
yeah, and so with the Renaissance and the scientific revolution and all that, we come to a different mind frame where we think of things more scientifically. And so, not that those things were necessarily bad, obviously. I mean, those things were good in a lot of ways, but there's I think we lose some things and we gain some things, right? And everything. So, I'm a student of hippie music. How many of you expected that? Probably. I like hippie music. I love the '60s. I like all that stuff. And so, and there's some good theology in that if you're careful. All right, if you're careful with it. There's some good quotes that sound very theological. I'll give you one. Joni Mitchell says this: "Something's lost and something's gained in living every day." That's pretty good, right? It's true, I think. So, and it's really true for these movements. Something's lost when the Renaissance comes, but something's gained. And this is why you end up getting bad leaders sometimes, and that's a whole different discussion. This guy's bringing something to the table that this guy wasn't, but he's also bringing a bunch of other stuff to the table that you weren't focused on until it's too late, right? So, okay, so what all that have to do with Job, right? Well, I think it's the idea that, to borrow something Francis Schaeffer said, God is there. Like God is there.
Yes.
The practice of the presence of God with Brother Lawrence that Virgil talks about. God is present. He's there with us. And a lot of times we don't think that because we're thinking scientifically. But Job is a metaphysical realist. He thinks God is right there in the midst of all this, you know, where we might separate the two things and think of it as more of a natural thing. And so he speaks about a lot of natural things in this book. He talks about nature a whole lot. There's trees and animals and mountains and gemstones and wind and rain and stars and oceans and all these things that he refers to. And I think the greatest example probably of metaphysical realism in Job is the tornado. When God shows up in the whirlwind in chapter 38. And when we think of the tornado, so we're from Oklahoma, Lori and I. So we've been around tornadoes a lot. And when I think of a tornado, I think of a weather pattern, right? I think of, wow, it's really cool to be close to a tornado. It's one of those vivid experiences of life. It's powerful. It's awesome. We like it. We don't want to get too close, but from a distance, it's great. But when I think of a tornado, my first thought is probably it's a weather phenomenon, you know. But for Job, he thinks of God. And that's the difference between metaphysical realism and not metaphysical realism. So, but Job is a metaphysical realist. He thinks God is present. He's there, and he is taking that all in. And of course, he's trying to assess all that's happening to him. But the idea of metaphysical realism, I think, is something that, you know, if we took more seriously, it would revolutionize our lives. if we really thought God was here right now, you know.
Well, I think that is part of what is so captivating to me about Brother Lawrence and others is that, you know, we tend to try to separate the spiritual and the non-spiritual, you
Right.
know. But in Him we live and move and have our being, and we weren't created for that separation. You know, and when it came into our lives, it created problems. So, you know, we want to compartmentalize all of this.
Mhm.
And it's
But-
not to be.
But I think it's very biblical to not, you know, to seek not to do that. And everything in our culture tends to want us to separate it. So it's a struggle that we have. But Job was definitely before the medieval period, right? So he has this going on that we skip right over because we don't have that mindset in the 21st century when we read the book of Job. So if you can put that back into the equation, I think it's very helpful to understand the book. Okay? All right, now let's go to the third one. Number 3. Okay. God does not think highly of bad apologetic arguments. All right, I'm actually going to read from the book of Job finally. All right. Job 13, 6 through 12. Listen to this. This is one of those things where you wouldn't know this was in the Bible if you just took the broad overview of Job, okay? Because you would never get to chapter 13. But Job says this, "Please hear my argument and listen to the contentions of my lips. Will you speak?" He's talking to these friends of his. "Will you speak what is unjust for God and speak what is deceitful for him? Will you show partiality for him? Will you contend for God? Will it be well when he examines you? Or will you deceive him as one deceives a man? He will surely reprove you if you secretly show partiality. Will not his majesty terrify you and the dread of him fall on you? Your memorable sayings are proverbs of ashes. Your defenses are defenses of clay." And when he's talking about their defenses are defenses of God. Like they're seeking to defend God when they talk to Job. They're showing partiality for God. And so all this bad stuff's happening to Job. Job says, "Hey, I don't deserve this." And they're all going, "No, you do." Okay? And here's why. And so in the process of that, they're presenting God in a certain character that is inaccurate in order to defend God, right? So these counselors, man, when I first see these counselors, like if I had a problem, like I was really sick, like Job, and I had 3 friends that showed up and just sat with me for 7 days and didn't say anything, I would think, wow, those guys, these are my friends, right? They're just mourning with me. So these guys start out great, and I'm thinking like they're super good friends, I would think. But then when they start talking, everything goes south, right? And they say all this stuff in defense of God, and they're trying to defend God and, you know, make sure that he's justified, but they do it in a wrong way, and they mischaracterize God in the process. So C.S. Lewis says this, and because you're probably thinking, I don't know if you're right, Scott. So I brought up C.S. Lewis to back me up, right? C.S. Lewis says this. This is the lesson of the book of Job. The lesson of the book of Job. The point is that the man who accepts our ordinary standard of good and by it hotly criticizes divine justice receives divine approval. The orthodox pious people who palter, which is a British word, I think, it means equivocate, with that standard in an attempt to justify God are condemned. Right? So These guys are putting forth bad apologetic arguments. So the question is, does God like that? And obviously the whole book of Job says, no, God doesn't like that. He likes good apologetic arguments, but not bad ones. So when we do bad apologetics, we're actually doing a big disservice to God. That's what C.S. Lewis says is the theme of the book of Job. I bet you didn't ever think that was the theme of the book of Job. You know, I never, until I read this and I was like, wow, that's really neat. And then I read C.S. Lewis and he's like, that's the theme of the book of Job. I'm like, wow, that's really what I thought it said. It really does say that. So now, there's a lot about apologetics that's great, and there's a lot of things that can be answered, and there's a lot more things that can be answered than I think we think can be answered. There's a lot of good stuff out there. But we can't answer everything, and there's going to be some mystery, and we're going to have eternity to learn and learn and learn. But I don't think we'll ever learn everything because God's infinite, right? So I don't want to say that you shouldn't attempt apologetics, but I'm saying you should be really, really good at it. We should all be great at it. We should be defending the faith. There's an organization called Ratio Christi, and I've been talking to a guy they have a chapter of it at UGA, and I had lunch with him a couple weeks ago, and I would like to be involved in that ministry. So it's an apologetics ministry on campus at Athens. So if I get connected with those guys, maybe I'll have a little more to share about this in the future, but I think apologetics is huge. I think it's very important for our culture in a time when Christianity is so marginalized, and we need to be strong on what we believe and why we believe it. And so, but we don't want to give bad apologetic arguments. So it's a whole field that we need to be studying to be good at it. And you don't want to just give surface answers. That's what Job's friends did. We don't want to do that. So does anybody, I'll tell you what, let me follow this up with number 4, and then we'll discuss the whole thing because they're kind of related. So let's go to, number 4, wrestling with God is rewarded by God. So this is what Job does. He refuses to let go of this argument. Like all his friends come and say, no, you're guilty, of all these things, and God's justly punishing, and he's doing right because he's God. Maybe we would think, oh, these guys are probably right, and we would start to agree. But Job doesn't do that. He sticks to his guns. He says, no, this isn't right. Something's wrong about this thing here, and I'm sticking to my story. And he keeps wrestling with God. It's sort of like, Jacob in Genesis, when he's coming back into the land, and the angel meets him, which was really the angel of the Lord, which was really God. And he wrestles with God right there. And he says, I won't let you go till you bless me. Right? It's kind of like that. Job's like, I want to figure out what's going on. This isn't right. Something's wrong with this. And I'm sticking to my story. I'm going to keep trying to find a solution to this. And really, he's trying also to justify God in the process, in the right way, right? Not the way that his friends are trying to do. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, yeah, in my work and things with driving for Goodwill, there's some people will comment, this may be a stupid question, but what about this? And I said, never think that any question is too dumb. As long as people are asking questions, I mean, even if they, we don't have all of our ducks in a row and things like that. But I said, the fact that you have an interest in wanting to know if this is right or wrong, or God does this, I said, you are on a track. Don't get discouraged. Keep asking. God is never demeaned anyone asking questions about him, about his word.
Right, and there's so many questions, right? And we all have them, and we don't have to know all the answers. We need to work on it and try to figure it out, but we're never going to have all the answers. But we can refer people to other stuff, say, I don't have all the answers, but I have to check this out, or that. So that, I think, is part of, trying to address the struggle that people could have. But so there's a scene from the movie Forrest Gump, right? Which I don't recommend as highly as this one. But
Maybe a little more exciting.
there's a scene. What's that?
Maybe a little more exciting.
Yeah, maybe a little more exciting. But Lieutenant Dan is Forrest's lieutenant, and he's on the shrimping boat with Forrest. And Lieutenant Dan has lost his legs in Vietnam, and so he's mad at God. And so he climbs to the top of the mast of the shrimping boat in the middle of the storm, and he's screaming out to God and just taking God on, right, on the mast of the shrimping boat. And he's just going all out. And he says some things that are probably pretty blasphemous, really, from our perspective. But later on in the story, he calms down, and Forrest is narrating the story, and he says, I believe Lieutenant Dan made his peace with God, right? So to me, I think of the book of Job when I think of Lieutenant Dan on the mast there. God is able to fight with us. He's willing to take the fight on, even when we don't say everything kosher and perfect, right? And we cry out to God and we say, this isn't right. And God's willing to engage with that. It's not, yeah.
Well, I think Matt has his hand up, and then I can go. I just want to add a little sound bite. Matt?
I was just going to say, you used to do a lot of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, right? And so it's grappling. That's what it is.
Yeah.
It's ground fighting. So the worst, and to get good at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you have to do this like probably 2 or 3 times a week. If you want to be professional, 4, 5, 6 times a week. If you want to really go far fast. But the worst days at the gym is when you're rolling with somebody and they're just sticking their knee in your chest and they're holding you down, and no matter what you do or try to get away, it is just this brutal thing. And when you get done, you're exhausted and you feel miserable because you've just been completely defeated for an hour or 2 here. Yeah. It's miserable. But it's probably the time that you grow the most in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, because you learn to deal through the suffering for one thing, and that you can deal with it. But you start to begin to think back to this. And I think spiritually, it's very similar with God. When we have those times that we're just really we feel brutalized in our life. But yet we look and we see that he's teaching us. He's leading us to something better, something more. So just kind of
that's good. Yeah, there's a lot of analogies we could bring up, I think, that would fit. I wanted to read a few things from Job here that kind of bring this out of his wrestling with God. So he says in chapter 30, 20 to 21, he says, I cry out to you for help, but you do not answer me. I stand up and you turn your attention against me. You have become cruel to me. With the might of your hand you persecute me. That's not what you would normally hear in church, right? He's seriously wrestling. Job 31, 35 to 37. Oh, that I had one to hear me. Behold, here is my signature. This is the very end. Let the Almighty answer me in the indictment which my adversary has written. I think he's saying my adversary is God. Surely I would carry it on my shoulder. I would bind it to myself like a crown. I would declare to him the number of my steps. Like a prince, I would approach him.
Pretty gutsy.
Yeah. 32 verse 2. So in 32 verse 2, then Elihu, the Hebrew guy, he shows up and he's mad, okay? And his anger burned against Job because he justified himself before God. So he's mad at Job because Job is justifying himself in this situation. So anyway, so that's just the thoughts, some of the thoughts that Job is having as he's wrestling with all this with God. Yes.
And of course, one of my favorite segments of scripture is Job 38. where God so beautifully says, you know, brace yourself like a man, because now I have some questions for you.
Yeah.
And I remember reading this on a prayer call, and I love the way my heart hears it. And this one guy was like, I've never heard it said like a friend. Like, all right, let's wrestle back. Where were you? It wasn't judgment. I don't sense it was like Job. It was more like, where were you?
I think it's part of the wrestling.
It's beautiful. I love that God's language comes back in just an almost irreverent, like, oh my gosh, but in a beautiful way.
Yeah.
Put your straps on, big boy.
Yeah.
Let's do that.
Right.
I love it.
Yeah.
It's just great.
Yeah, and then he talks about all these natural things that God's doing that
Beautiful.
we don't understand.
Yeah. It kind of takes our good questions away.
Yeah, well, okay, so that leads into number 5, but that's a great lead into number 5. Yeah.
Well, you know, I think that you were talking about how it sounds blasphemous, the way, you know, almost the way the person is in Forrest Gump, but also in the way that Job is addressing, why did you let me be born? Why did blah, blah, blah? You know, all these things, you know, this doesn't make any sense. It would be better that I hadn't been born.
Yeah.
And I remember a time when and it had nothing to do with such extreme physical suffering as Job, but God knows how to hit what needs to be hit in our lives. And I was just so frustrated with God. He was worried that I was going to commit the unpardonable sin and, you know, that I was being blasphemous. And I thought, you know, if he's God, he can take it. You know, I mean, for seriously, why in the world, you know, and then that verse came to me that he will not crush a bruised reed and he will not smother a smoldering flax. And I just said, okay, that's your word, and if you are who you say you are, I give it to you. I'm bruised and I am smoldering. And honestly, there was a turn in the night with that. I love that passage where God comes back to Job too. So many people see it as being, you know, God is just still not being kind to him. I think it was the greatest kindness in the world. He said, this is who I am. I'm going to give you a chance to look at me. Behold my glory. Wow, that is wonderful, you know, and that's exactly what he did with me.
I think in Job, maybe you could pick out a verse here or there and start to think that the Bible is not inspired. But if you read the whole book together, you can see how it fits together. And you can take a larger inspiration, I think, out of it. Does that make sense? I just kind of thought of that as you were talking, but I think that's accurate. Okay. Let's go to number 5, Allison. Susan, you segued right into this one. Seeing God somehow makes our questions less important. So, I don't think they go away. I don't think the questions go away. But it does seem to make them less important. So, Paul, for example, in 2 Corinthians 4, talks about this momentary light affliction is producing in us an eternal weight of glory. Kind of like, Matt, what you were saying, just the afflictions end up producing, you know, this greater thing that you can't get unless you go through the trial. And so James does that as well when he starts off his book. This idea of trials producing endurance in us so that we'll be complete. You know, I think we see this over and over. We have 5 minutes, okay. So, seeing God somehow makes our questions less important. And I think that's because he desires our deeper happiness, not just this surface happiness that we're happy with, but something deeper. And he loves us enough to push us on to this deeper happiness, right? Which is the beatific vision of God. We hear about it in Numbers chapter 6, for example, but then Job in chapter 42. Now my eyes see you, and I retract, and I repent in dust and ashes. And so, just this vision for which God has created us to see. He wants us to see him. And I don't think he's going to stop for his children until he lets us see him. And part of that means we have to go through all this stuff. You know, there's no other way to get there, maybe. Number 6, I've only got 5 minutes, so I'm going to let you in on the last two. Number 6, what Satan means for evil, God can turn toward good. That's a huge discussion, right? It's the story of Job. I think it's the story of the Bible, and the whole Bible, in a sense. There's a book here that I would refer you to. It's I think a helpful book in terms of the book of Job. Now My Eyes Have Seen You by Robert Fryall. It's edited by D.A. Carson. In this book, he makes a case for the last thing that Job talks about, or the book of Job talks about in chapter 41, is Leviathan. What is Leviathan? And it's Middle Eastern mythology, really. Leviathan is a sea monster. He's sometimes called a dragon. He's sometimes called a serpent. But I think what this book talks about is that Job's using that mythology to point to Satan. And it's sort of a complicated. I don't have time to get into it probably. I'll say one verse here. At the end of chapter 42. 41:34. Leviathan looks on everything that is high. He is king over all the sons of pride. That doesn't sound necessarily like a sea serpent, right? Sounds like something a little more. And that's the point of that book. So if you think of it that way, if Leviathan is a figure for Satan, then you've got Satan in chapter 1 showing up in God's court. You got Satan in chapter 41, so the book is kind of bookended by Satan. And then you've got 42, which is kind of the epilogue, which everything is restored in Job. So I think that's interesting, and this is something to think about. You can look at that and see what you think. Or actually, I'd encourage you to get this book. But some people say, well, Leviathan is dinosaur. This is a description of dinosaur, and on and on. I think that's bad apologetics. Lesson 3. All right, so there's that one, and then just the last one. Let's go just the last one. When an atheist uses evil to argue for atheism, he actually argues for God. And I want you to make sure you understand this one. So there's 2 quotes from a book I want to read you. But the idea here is that, and this is kind of an indirect argument that you can glean from Job. Anytime a person argues that they're an atheist and there's no God because there's so much evil in the world, they've just defeated atheism. And the reason is because they're assuming that there is a distinction between good and evil. And when you assume a distinction between good and evil on an atheistic, naturalistic worldview, it doesn't work. If there's really good and evil, there has to be a source for good and evil. And so they're borrowing from the Christian cookie jar in a sense. They're assuming evil. And if you assume evil, you have to assume good. So then you're back to God again, right? So there's a book here that I've been reading, and he's an atheist. Okay? So his book is all about this. But just to give you a gist of this book, he says, this then is what a theory of everything has to explain. Not only the emergence from a lifeless universe of reproducing organisms and their development by evolution to a greater and greater functional complexity, not only the consciousness of some of those organisms and its central role in their lives, but also the development of consciousness into an instrument of transcendence that can grasp objective reality and objective value. This is what we're trying to explain, he says. And then he says, all that can be done at this stage in the history of science is to argue for recognition of the problem, not to offer solutions. He's saying we have no idea. This guy is like top-notch atheist, naturalist, scientist. They have no idea how to explain it on a naturalistic worldview. And he admits it, but he won't give up the search because he's a naturalist. But anytime you find an atheist saying, hey, there's a lot of evil in the world, and this isn't right, he's just defeated atheism. So File that away. That's good apologetics, okay? I think we've got to go. Does anybody have any final thoughts?
I had a final thought on number 6.
Okay.
About what Satan wants to do, God can turn it to good.
Yeah.
There was a couple that were our neighbors in Ecuador. They were on their way. She contracted blood disease, right? They were on their way, been to doctors and everything. They were on their way to see which doctor. And something put it in their mind, we know who did, to come by and talk to us. They came to visit us in the house. And they told about the doctors can't help and that they know somebody's been cured by which doctor. And I said, stop, I want to show you a better way. So we just opened Ephesians 2 them, the scriptures. They accepted the Lord. Within a week, God healed her. And they became one of the first couples in the new church who were planting here in Humboldt.
Yeah.
Anyway, so.
Yeah. So we didn't have time to develop number 6, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
But,
I just felt I should share that.
Yeah, no, that's great. But he certainly can and does, and I think that's the whole story of the Bible, really, is fall. And if there was no fall, there'd be no way to, what would be the point of Jesus coming and going through?
Praise God.
Right? Yes, sir.
May I add something?
Yeah.
And don't fall back on a good voice. Like Ron, I lived in South America for many years.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say how in the States, Satan has done a wonderful job of hiding his identity. And most folks are just not aware of who he is. It's some funny guy with a tail and some big ears or whatever. If you go to South America as I did, and I was involved in voodoo, black magic rituals, I got a marriage under a black magic ritual. Satan is very, very real.
He's very real here too.
Very,
It just comes
very
about
real.
it in a little more
Most folks
sneaky
think
way.
it's a joke. It's not. It's very real.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that goes back to what you were saying, the combination of the natural and supernatural is very combined there, where we separate it out. So Satan's tricky in that too, right? He keeps it separated in our minds, and that's a trick.
It really is. He's done a good job of it.
Let's go to the Lord in prayer, and we'll get ready to. Okay. Father, we thank you so much for who you are. We thank you for your greatness and your power and your love for us and your willingness to have us go through difficult things because you love us, so you can put us on the other side of that with a greater perspective and a greater understanding of you. And Lord, I pray for people in our church right now that are going through difficult things, and I pray, Lord, that you would help them in such difficult circumstances to see you more clearly, to just take life just to perceive life with more reality, to know that you're there, to know that you're with us, to know that you're good, you're going to turn things that are bad into good, and all these things that we learn from Job. And so I just pray that you would be with those in our midst that are suffering. Lord, I pray you give us wisdom to know how to address issues in the world that come at us, that challenge the faith. Give us wisdom on that. We just thank you for your presence with us today. We know you're really here. And I pray that you would be with us in a vivid and powerful way this morning as we worship you. And we will give you the glory in Jesus' name. Amen.